These were not reckless men. They were the only subjects their science could trust. A mosquito allowed to finish feeding. A rubber tube pushed toward a beating heart. One doctor never did what the legend says. Halfway through, an insect decides whether another survives. The final experiment costs one doctor his career. Decades before the same idea earns him a Nobel Prize. The needle that didn't fit. The cerebrospinal fluid dripped clean and steady from the hollow needle in August Beer's spine, proof the puncture had worked. Then his assistant, August Hildebrandt, tried to fit a syringe of cocaine solution onto the needle's hub, and it wouldn't connect. Fluid and drug spilled across the table instead of into Beer's back. The date was August 1898, in a surgical clinic in Kiel, Germany, and the two men were trying to prove a patient could be numbed from the waist down without the risks of full anesthesia, an idea many surgeons considered reckless. The plan failed for Beer, so that evening the two switched roles, and Hildebrandt received a working injection instead. To test how deep the numbness went, Beer struck his assistant's shin with an iron surgical mallet and pressed a lit cigar to his skin. Hildebrandt felt nothing. Spinal cocaine interrupted pain signals like cutting a line at a switchboard. The lower body stopped sending pain upward even while Hildebrandt remained awake. Beer, 36, got no such relief. With no drug delivered, cerebrospinal fluid continued to leak through the puncture, and he spent 9 days confined to bed with a severe headache. The vaccine he hid from everyone. In July of 1892, at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, Valdemar Haffkine filled a glass syringe with a weakened cholera culture he had grown himself, lifted his shirt, and injected it into his own side. He had no permission to test it on a person. Cholera was still explained by many older physicians as a disease carried in bad air, not a living organism you could grow in a lab. The idea of deliberately putting a killer bacterium into healthy blood struck most of his colleagues as a slow form of suicide. Within hours, Haffkine had a fever and a swollen, aching side. He never reported the reaction to his supervisors. The vaccine resembled a fire drill. It let the immune system rehearse a threat before the real exposure arrived. Haffkine, 32, recovered. By late 1895, his own published account listed more than 40,000 people inoculated during the Indian cholera campaign. The diary dictated until death. He was 28, a medical student, not yet a doctor, and that didn't stop him from settling an argument no one else would test. Daniel Alcides Carrion believed that two illnesses doctors treated as separate, a disfiguring skin condition called Peruvian warts, and a fever that was killing railroad workers outside Lima, were actually one disease at different stages. In August of 1885, he convinced a hesitant colleague to inoculate him with material taken from a patient's wart, since testing his own idea on somebody else felt like a betrayal of it. Friends warned him off. He refused to stop. Within weeks, the fever hit, and his blood cells began breaking down as if rust were eating through metal from the inside. As he grew too weak to hold a pen, he kept dictating his own symptoms, hour by hour, to classmates who took turns at his bedside, determined that his body would still be useful as evidence even after his mind gave out. Carrion died on the 5th of October, 39 days after the infection began. His notes proved what colleagues had refused to believe, that the wart and the fever were the same disease, and it was later named for him, Carrion's disease. The myth that never happened. 18th century doctors treated gonorrhea and syphilis like two labels on the same bottle. The same poison, they believed, just named differently depending on where it spilled on the body. John Hunter, one of London's most respected anatomists, tested that idea in 1767 by infecting a patient with pus from a gonorrhea case and tracking how the disease developed. For over a century afterward, popular biographers claimed Hunter had performed the experiment on his own body, and that he later died from the very disease he'd supposedly given himself. Neither part holds up. George Kvist's 1977 review argued that Hunter had used another person rather than himself, and that his autopsy supported vascular disease rather than syphilis. Hunter had been about 39 when he ran the experiment, and he died in 1793. The flaw was a mixed sample. Using material from a person carrying both infections was like testing two inks in one bottle and blaming the final color on only one. Hunter concluded that the two diseases were identical, and the error persisted for many more decades afterward. The mosquito allowed to feed. A mosquito landed on the back of a hand in a fever ward in Havana, and the hand didn't move. Jesse Lazier, a 34-year-old bacteriologist working under Walter Reed's Yellow Fever Commission, watched the insect fill itself with his blood and let it finish. For years, doctors had blamed yellow fever on filth, dirty lemons, soiled clothing, rotting waste in the streets, and cities had spent fortunes scrubbing pavement that had nothing to do with the disease. Lazier suspected a living vector rather than contaminated objects. The mechanism resembled a courier route. The mosquito picked up the infection from one sick person and carried it to the next, much as a contaminated razor can carry infection between users. After 9 days, Lazier developed yellow fever. His death came on the 25th of September, 1900. For years, official accounts treated the fatal exposure as accidental. By 1947, Philip Hench's study of Lazier's own notebook showed that the exposure had been deliberate. Lazier died at 34. Later controlled work by the Commission helped shift yellow fever prevention toward mosquito control. The ration they tested themselves. Britain was bracing for starvation. If German submarines cut off shipping, the government needed to know exactly how little a person could eat and still work a full day. So 2 nutrition scientists decided to find out on their own bodies first. Elsie Widdowson and Robert McCants spent months eating almost nothing but bread and potatoes, with meat, cheese, sugar, and fat rationed down to a few ounces a week each. During a winter trial in 1940, they tested the diet with long bicycle rides and mountain hikes in England's Lake District. They also found that the diet supplied too little calcium. Adding calcium carbonate to flour worked like putting a missing ingredient back into a recipe. The bread carried extra calcium even when milk and cheese were scarce. The work helped shape wartime bread policy. Widdowson, 34 during the trial, continued nutrition research for decades afterward and later became a Fellow of the Royal Society, remaining active in nutrition research well beyond the wartime years. And drinking cholera. Max von Pettenkofer was 73 years old when he picked up a glass of live cholera bacteria and drank it in front of witnesses in Munich. He didn't believe Robert Koch's claim that a single microbe alone could cause the disease. Pettenkofer thought a germ was only half the story, like a seed that needs the right soil. Without the specific damp, dirty ground of a place, he argued, the bacteria that caused cholera elsewhere would do nothing at all in a healthy body. So first he drank a dose of baking soda to cancel out his stomach acid, giving the bacteria their best possible chance to survive, and prove him wrong if he was mistaken. 2 days later, he came down with severe diarrhea, which he insisted was nothing more than a minor stomach upset, not real cholera. He recovered, declared his soil theory vindicated, and a student of his repeated the same experiment weeks later with the same result. Modern doctors reading the case believe both men most likely survived thanks to partial immunity from earlier, milder exposure to the bacteria, not because the theory was correct. Pettenkofer proved the opposite of what he thought he proved. The bacteria had made him sick. He simply lived long enough to deny it. The bacteria he drank on purpose. For decades, American doctors were certain ulcers came from stress, not from anything you could catch. Patients were told to relax, eat blander food, and take antacids for the rest of their lives. Barry Marshall, a 33-year-old gastroenterologist in Perth, Australia, thought a spiral-shaped bacterium was the real cause. He did not seek ethics approval for the self-experiment he planned. In July of 1984, he swallowed a broth containing the bacterium grown from a stomach biopsy taken from a patient. Within days, he developed nausea and gastritis. The bacteria behaved less like a passing bug and more like a tenant, settling into the stomach lining like a weed rooting under mulch. Marshall's own colleagues had biopsied his stomach before the experiment to prove it was healthy, then biopsied it again afterward to show the damage. For years afterward, most doctors still dismissed the theory, and it took roughly 2 decades for the medical establishment to catch up. In 2005, Marshall was awarded half of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery, after years of skepticism toward the work. The catheter he threaded himself. A rubber catheter entered a vein at the crook of Werner Forssmann's arm in 1929. At 25, he was a newly trained doctor in Eberswalde, Germany, and his chief had barred the idea from being tried on a patient. Forssmann wanted to show that a tube could travel through a vein into the heart without causing the instant collapse many physicians feared. He advanced the catheter about 65 centimeters, a little more than 2 school rulers laid end to end. using the route like a plumber following a pipe toward a tank. With the catheter still in place, he went to the X-ray department and documented its tip in his right atrium. The result proved the route was physically possible. The experiment did not launch his academic career. Resistance from senior physicians blocked further work in the field, and he later spent much of his career outside cardiology. Two American researchers later developed cardiac catheterization into a powerful research method. In 1956, Forssman shared that year's medicine Nobel with them. He lived until 1979 and died after a heart attack, decades after the organ he once entered with a catheter made him famous. Which one of these doctors do you think was braver? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe for the next story medicine tried to forget.